For those of you who tuned in late, we are taking our annual Independence Day look at freedom. What makes up freedom? How can we accurately measure it in society? And how can it be destroyed? In the first segment, I explained the most obvious of elements in freedom: choice. Freedom is about making choices. Consequently, if you want to destroy freedom, you can start by limiting those choices. The second element in freedom, which I explained before we went to break, is the flip side of choice, namely responsibility. Owning up to the consequences of your choices, both the positive and the negative ones. And a good way to destroy freedom is to mess with those consequences. In other words, not holding people to account for the negative consequences of their choices, or to suppress people from enjoying the positive consequences of their choices. Now, there are some people who will look at this and say this is enough. That these two things, choice and responsibility, are the only things you need for there to be freedom in society. And indeed, the two dominant political factions will have you believe that because they each champion one of those two elements. Liberals champion the element of choice, and they firmly believe that the more choices that are out there, the more freedom there is in society. Likewise, conservatives champion the element of responsibility. They believe that freedom comes from holding people accountable for the choices they make. Neoconservatives, on the other hand, they don't give a shit about either of those two elements. They just think that freedom's an empty political buzzword for them to banter about to get their way. So they really don't matter in this particular discussion. This is why liberals and conservatives have been able to successfully play off each other, because they each take one of those two elements and they hype them up at the expense of the other element. The other side does the same, and they are led to believe that this is all that matters, that as long as they're able to do this, play this little game of give and take, that there is freedom in America. They are wrong. They are painfully wrong. Because there is one more element that is missing from the equation. One more element that actually balances out both sides. The element which is essential for any group to even exist. Individuality. Yes, individuality is the missing element when it comes to freedom. It is the one that we take for granted, more so than choice or responsibility. We assume that when we are talking about choice, that we're talking about individual choices. And when we talk about responsibility, we assume that we are talking about individual responsibility. And yet when we start talking about restricting choices, when we start messing with responsibility, what is the first thing that is eliminated from all discussion? The individual. All of a sudden, it becomes a matter of the group, the collective, the institution, the all-important, all-essential society itself. The individual is completely removed from the equation, and it is done so on purpose. Because that is the only way that you can sell the restriction of freedom. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. That was from Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. But the origin of that saying actually comes not from the Gospel of John, but from Aristotle, who said that the security of one individual's good is cause for rejoicing, but to secure the good of a nation or of a city-state is nobler and more divine. And that is the rationality that people use to destroy freedom by removing individuality from the equation. All of a sudden, individual choices become group choices. Individual responsibility is morphed into collective responsibility. How many times have you heard a Bible thumper complain about some collective morality? That we collectively are suffering because we allow for individuals to make choices that the thumper doesn't agree with. If you listen to American Heathen enough times, you'll hear at least one or two of these a month, and usually from their own words. Look at the Catholic Church and its ongoing problem with priests molesting kids. Oh, they know that it's a problem. They know it. but rather than holding the individual priest responsible for their actions, they claim that they have a much higher responsibility to the church, to the group. Look at the arguments against same-sex marriage. All of them say the same thing, that the institution, the collective, the group, society itself is far more important than the individuals involved. By the way, the same arguments were also invoked when it came to mixed races and with mixed religions. And if we didn't find a way to overcome those same arguments back then I, as an individual, would literally not be here today to talk about it. I, as an individual, would have never been born if we heeded those same arguments back when they involved mixed religions. Let's get really honest here. You cannot have freedom without the individual. It does not exist in a communal sense at all, period. You cannot tell a group that they are free without first going to each and every member of that group and tell them person to person, you are free. One only has to look at our failing economy to see how important the value of the individual is. The individuals are the ones that are losing jobs. The individuals are the ones that are losing their savings, losing their homes, and losing their futures. And yet our government has accepted this fairy tale created by Wall Street and political consultants that says that the country can somehow survive if we just spend billions to collective groups and not worry about those individuals getting new jobs. Just write off those individuals. Write them off. They're lazy anyways. Get rid of them. Who cares about them? Just focus on the corporations. Just focus on Wall Street. Just focus on the banks. Just focus on the companies that are too big to fail, and we will somehow get through it all. Yet somehow we're not. That is what the fantasy of a jobless recovery is about. It says that the collective will somehow survive if we just get rid of those annoying little things called individuals. The collective kills freedom. The collective kills freedom by declaring that it is more important than the individuals that comprise it. Without the individual, you can restrict or eliminate choices easily. Without the individual, you can mess with the balance of responsibility, depriving people of positive consequences and also avoiding the negative consequences. And both can be done in the same name, for the good of the collective. Look at sovereign immunity. It says that the government is never wrong, ever. Even when they've done wrong, you cannot hold the government to account. And you cannot hold the individuals that represent government to account for their actions unless they do something that profits them individually. Lawmakers can spend $700 billion bailing out Wall Street for their collective greed and their collective fiscal mismanagement and think nothing of it. But if a member of a lawmaker's staff uses a government ATM card to take out $700 at a local strip club, then that is declared an unforgivable sin, even though that $700 will do far more to stimulate the local economy than the whole $700 billion that was handed to Wall Street. It's crazy, I know, but that is the hypocrisy of the collective. It is the individual that keeps choices and responsibility in their proper perspective. Without individuality, we are deprived of making certain choices, not because those choices have some adverse effect on ourselves, but because of the hypothetical greater good of the collective. You are barred from reading Playboy magazine because some little child may come across an issue and ask why the woman in the centerfold has two balloons in her chest and why there's no dangling pee-pee between her legs, and that society doesn't want to have to answer those kind of embarrassing questions. You can't listen to Shocknet Radio because they bring up subjects that demean organized religion, and that's just an unforgivable sin, even if the information is accurate. And if the individual is not free, how can we then say that society is free? How can we say that the collective is free when the individuals that comprise that collective are living in fear of that collective? If their every word is subject to scrutiny and censorship, if everything they personally own are subject to search and seizure at any time for any reason whatsoever, if the choices they make are subject to veto not on the basis of personal gain or loss, but because somewhere in the world, some group doesn't want you to make those choices. That is how important the element of individuality is to freedom. And there you have it. You now have a barometer to measure freedom in any group, in any region, in any country. You measure it on the kinds of choices they are allowed to make in regards to their lives, how they are allowed to enjoy in the positive consequences of those choices and account for the negative choices, and on how that group values the individual members that comprise it. And if those three things are not balanced, then that is when tyranny creeps in. That is when freedom becomes nothing more than an empty buzzword be bantered about. We constantly hear the neoconservatives worrying about the threat of socialism, worrying about the threat of communism, worrying about the threat of Islamic theocracy. But this country spent 8 years proving that the neocon option is not the answer to those things. You do not defeat the encroachment of the collective with yet another collective. You defeat the encroachment of the collective with the balance of choice, responsibility, and individuality. You defeat the collective with freedom.
He is the creator and sustainer of all the worlds, whether those worlds are known or unknown to mankind.